Today's video is sponsored by Armra Colostrum. I'll share more on them coming up. Today I want to share with you a little bit about my weekly sourdough baking routine. This is something I usually do about once a week, and it's a really easy routine and schedule to kind of just go through each week. I know there's a lot of mystery around creating your own baking schedule with sourdough because it can be a little bit tricky, so I thought I would share mine. This is what I do each week usually if I want a loaf of crusty bread and I want a loaf of nice soft and fluffy sourdough sandwich bread. So these are two of my favorite recipes. They're on my website, but I'm actually going to switch things up a little bit today and use a different all-purpose flour. This one is new to me and it's a white all-purpose kamut flour. The reason I want to try this out is because it's really high in protein. It has 14.5% protein content, which is like the highest I think I've heard of. And then it's full of amino acids, it's high in electrolytes, so there's a lot of health benefits to this flour. And I figure, hey, if I'm gonna make a white bread for my family using all-purpose flour, let me find one of the healthiest I can, and I think I have it right here. I'm gonna be using that today. And then I also like to use a little bit of Celtic sea salt in my bread, so I'm just showing you some of the ingredients. That way you can use them too if you want. So this is just a really nice unrefined sea salt. And then I'm also using a new baking pan today that I want to try because I typically use one that is ceramic and I want to move over to something that is stainless steel. So I am trying this out. It's the most non-toxic kind of baking pan you can use other than cast iron. So I want to try these because I know I can put them in the dishwasher and they'll get nice and clean every time. I also love using what I call my dough tubs. I have a few of them and they're so easy for mixing your dough right in here. If you're making one that you just mix together in a bowl or something, I mix it together in here instead, and it's so much easier because it has a lid, so I don't have to fuss with plastic wrap or anything, and it's great for even storing in the fridge overnight. So I use these. That's one of my favorite tools, but I'll have all my tools linked down below. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you my once a week sourdough routine and baking schedule starting with last night. I wrote down the timing of everything I did, so that will help you kind of gauge it, but it does change from season to season. Maybe you live in a different elevation. There's so many different factors, including the temperature of your house. So remember, sourdough is a living thing and it changes, so it's really important to just learn to watch it and look for certain signs like doubling and rising in textures. Around 7:30 last night, I started by pulling out my sourdough starters that I keep in the fridge. These had not been fed all week, so I'm discarding everything into another jar just so that I can start with my measurements and not have anything in those jars. So I'm going to feed both of these jars to create enough sourdough starter for both of my bread recipes. I'm going to be making 2 different loaves, just one of each. And I like to keep 2 jars in the fridge, that way I have enough to make multiple recipes. But then if I don't want to make 2 recipes that week, then I can just feed one of those starters and keep the other container in the fridge. So instead of having one big one, I just split it up and I don't have to feed it as often. So I turn on my scale, I placed my jar on top and I tear the scale to 0. I'll pour in some of my reserved sourdough starter that was in my jars from earlier, and then I'll add in a little bit of either lukewarm water or just room temperature water. I'll take that off the scale, stir it together, and then put it back on the scale, tear it to 0 again, and sprinkle in just regular all-purpose flour. Not bread flour, just all-purpose. That's my favorite to bake with. I'll sprinkle that in and then I'll stir it together. And if you don't want to use a digital scale, that's not a problem. You can definitely do it without. I just find it really easy to always get it accurate. And it's also really easy to teach other people how to do it this way because it's just an accurate way of measuring. And since I like to give you guys my recipes, I like to make sure that it is as accurate as I can make them. This is also what changed my sourdough journey, is moving from cups over to baking scales. It just made the world of a difference, and I always get it to turn out just how I'm hoping for. It's easier to make it foolproof. So it's a nice thick starter. You want to make sure that if you're baking my recipes, your starter is nice and thick and you feed it with the right measurements, which I will have all of this linked down below. I have full blog posts on all of these recipes. So you don't want it to be too runny at this stage. Then I just took my other jar of sourdough starter and did the exact same thing, and I'll leave that to ferment and I can make something else with that or just store it in the fridge as sourdough discard, but I do like to feed my starters once a week just to keep them healthy. So after those sourdough starters ferment overnight, it will look like this. This is one that I already did because for my soft sandwich bread, you make a pre-ferment. So I'm going to take my nice active bubbly sourdough starter and I'm going to feed it this time specifically for this soft sourdough sandwich bread. So I'm going to put it on my scale and I'm going to measure in that sourdough starter. You can either do the active starter first or the water first. If you're not sure if your starter is active all the way, then I would do the water first, then do the starter so you can see if it floats, because that's kind of like a float test. And if it doesn't float, you know your starter is not active enough. But mine is definitely active. You can see tons of bubbles. So I put my sourdough starter in first, tare the scale to 0, then add in that lukewarm or room temperature water, take it off the scale, give it a nice stir, mix it all together. And at this point, it'll just look like floury water. It won't look like active starter anymore. Put it back on your scale, tare it to 0, and sprinkle in just regular all-purpose flour. And this is going to be our pre-ferment for our soft sourdough sandwich bread. So it's an exact measurement. You don't have to worry about the thickness of your starter with this recipe because it has that pre-ferment, and I'm learning to love those more and more. I used to think they were really complicated, but now I feel like it just makes the process easier because there's less guesswork. So to make these doughs at the same time, I like to have one sourdough starter being fed, and then I like to have one sourdough starter that's already been fed and is active and bubbly. So feed that one about 12 hours beforehand or first thing in the morning. Then you can put together the leaven or the pre-ferment that I just made. Then you'll let that sourdough starter that you fed and the pre-ferment that you made sit out overnight on the counter, and then in the morning we will put together our bread doughs. My goal is to get these breads to be baked at roughly the same time, one after the other, so I don't have to turn my oven back on and I can just bake them off at the same time. So I'm starting with my crusty sourdough loaf here. This is a crusty sandwich bread. It's a round bowl. So I'm going to start by adding in the correct amount of sourdough starter straight into the dough tub. That way I can mix up my dough in this tub and I will leave it on the counter to ferment in this. Now for my other sandwich bread, I have to mix it in a mixer, or you can mix it by hand, and then I'll put that dough into my dough tub and let that ferment on the counter as well. So I have my sourdough starter in here. I'm just drizzling in the amount of water that I need, take it off the scale and mix it together just like you did when we are feeding the sourdough starter and making the pre-ferment. I'll put it back on my digital scale, tare it to 0, and then I will sprinkle in the kamut flour or just regular all-purpose flour. And if you wanted to use whole wheat flour or a mix of whole wheat and all-purpose flour, the process would be the same, just the measurements would be different. So you could sprinkle in all-purpose flour, tare the scale to 0, and then sprinkle in the amount of whole wheat flour you want to do. Now, after I added in my flour into the dough tub, I'm going to add in my salt. I like to do it right into the flour. Some people will wait to incorporate the salt later, but I find that I prefer to incorporate it now. I think it just mixes into the dough better, and I haven't seen any ill effects. So I like to do it this way because it's just more simple. So I'll take that off the scale and I'll mix it all together. And at this point, it's just kind of going to be a shaggy dough, and that's exactly what you want. It'll just kind of come into a loose ball, but it won't be perfectly smooth or anything like that, so you don't have to look for that. We're just going to mix it together. I like to use a wooden spoon or a spurtle here, or you can just use your hands, and then I'm going to cover it with my lid and let this sit at room temperature for 30 minutes before I touch it again, and we'll work on the next process. After the dough is rested for 30 minutes, it's had the opportunity for that flour to absorb some of the water, and the dough becomes a lot more smooth. So I like to take some water and I will wet my hands versus adding in more flour. I don't like to do that. I just wet my hands and it makes it easier to work with. and I will just stretch that dough up a few times and fold it over on itself. It's not going to be super glutinous yet, so don't worry. It's going to have time to ferment and let all of that gluten develop. And because it's a hydrated dough, we don't need to knead it and stretch it and fold it like you would with a low hydration dough. And it just makes my favorite kind of crumb. It's super chewy and airy, and there's lots of bubbles, and it's just delicious. Now, because I'm using the kamut flour, it is going to have a slightly different texture. It's similar to einkorn, but you get a lot fluffier crumb, and I absolutely love this flour. It is one of my favorites now. So I'm just gonna mix that with my hand a little bit until it starts to come together, and I will leave that to bulk ferment now. I want to share with you about one of my favorite things to take every single day, and that is Armra colostrum. So if you don't know what colostrum is, it's actually a bioactive whole food. It's been amazing for my gut health and my bloating, and it's so much easier to digest these foods when your gut health is working well. I love that it just makes me feel lighter overall. And the difference between Armra colostrum and other different colostrums is that it is cold chain biopotent pasteurization. So all 400 plus of those bioactive nutrients we can actually absorb and reap all the benefits of, and it's really a great way to optimize your gut health, which is linked to so many different things. And it's super easy to get into your daily routine. You can just take 3 to 4 scoops a day like I do in my smoothie, or put it in a cup of water, or you can just dry scoop it and put it in your mouth and chew it. So we worked out a special offer for my subscribers. You can go to tryarmra.com/healthyelizabeth, and they're gonna give you 15% off your first order, so you can try it out. That is tryarmra.com/healthyelizabeth, or you can just enter code Healthy Elizabeth, and that will give you that 15% off. Thank you so much to Armra colostrum for sponsoring today's video. So after I put together my crusty sourdough bread dough, now I'm gonna put together my soft sandwich sourdough bread. And this is similar to an Amish bread because it has milk and butter and honey, and I find it just makes the best texture and flavor, and this is our favorite white bread recipe. So for this, I like to get a little saucepan or a skillet. I have this little mini cast iron one, which is fantastic. And I put it on the scale, and I will measure in my butter, always salted butter, whole milk, honey. Local or raw is my favorite to use, but you can use any kind of honey here. I'm also going to sprinkle in a little bit of that sea salt just to give it extra added flavor. You always want to make sure you're using plenty of salt in bread. It's the same thing like with stock or broth. If you don't add salt, it's not going to have any flavor. So you want to make sure that you're putting in plenty of salt, and I love the Celtic sea salt for this, or any kind of sea salt. Those are my favorites. And so I'll add that in too, and then we're gonna put this over a low heat on the stove, and just until that butter starts to melt and the milk becomes nice and warm. Then I'll just take it off the heat for a few minutes and let it cool down. You wanna make sure that if you put your finger into it, that it's not gonna burn it, it's not gonna be too warm. You just want it to be slightly warmer than room temperature. For this soft white sandwich bread, I am going to make it in a KitchenAid stand mixer, but if you don't have a stand mixer, you can definitely do it by hand. You're just gonna need to knead it a little bit longer. So I like to fit mine with a dough hook, and I actually replaced the dough hook that came with this one. It came with one that may have been steel, I think, but I noticed that no matter what I did to wash it, it always ended up leaving little black marks in my dough. So I actually found this one on Amazon and replaced it, and it works so much better. So that's a little tip. Now I'm taking some of my kamut flour and I'm measuring that out into a glass bowl, and then I'm going to be sprinkling that into the stand mixer. So I measured all that flour out separately, so it's ready to go. I don't have to think about it. You could also do that directly in your stand mixer bowl though, but I prefer to do it this way so I can have it soak in the milk mixture first before I add in the flour. So this is that pre-ferment we made last night. It's been sitting here and it's ready to go. It's bubbly, it's doubled in size. So I'm gonna pour that into the bowl of my stand mixer. And unlike when you're just feeding your sourdough starter, when you're doing your pre-ferment, you want to make sure that you get every last drop out of that jar. Now I will pour in that warmed and cooled milk and butter and honey and salt mixture. I'll turn my mixer on low just for a couple minutes to let that mixture mix together, and then I'll let that pre-ferment and milk mixture sit there for about 20 minutes before I add in the flour. This just gives it kind of a chance to activate and hydrate and make sure that it's going to give our bread a nice rise. After 20 minutes had gone by, I sprinkled in all of that flour that I had measured out, and then I'll turn my dough hook on low until everything gets combined. Then I will actually turn it up to medium, and I'll let that mix on medium speed for about 10 to 12 minutes. You want this to mix for a nice long time, get it nice and stretched and really smooth, and then we will take it out of the stand mixer and leave it to bulk ferment. The dough should transform into this really soft and supple dough, and it should come completely off the sides. So after 10 or so minutes, if it's still clinging to the side, make sure that you've either scraped it down or you can add in a touch more flour just to make sure that it pulls off the side. But I like to make sure that I just mix it long enough to where it really pulls together and sticks to my dough hook. Then I'll remove it from the stand mixer and put it into my dough tub, cover it with a lid, and leave that dough on the counter too to ferment. These will need to bulk ferment at room temperature for 6 to 8 hours, depending on your environment, of course, before we ever need to touch them again. I like to leave these doughs to ferment for 6 to 8 hours, but depending on the conditions in my kitchen, whether it's warmer or cooler in the time of year, or just the time I have that day, kind of determines when I shape my dough. So this can be between 6 and 8 hours later. So I will take some flour and sprinkle that into a banneton basket, either a round one or an oval one. And this is what I'm using for my crusty bread. So I'm going to dust that, and I like to do it straight into the banneton basket. I don't even do a tea towel, but you can definitely use a tea towel too. I just love the beautiful ridges it gives the exterior of the bread after you bake it. This dough has been rising for about 6 hours, and I could leave it 8 hours and it would be even puffier at this point, but I want to make sure that I have it in time for tonight. So I'm going to take the dough out now, and I wet my hands with some filtered water, and then I will pull that dough out of the dough tub and onto my counter. I don't flour my counter or anything. I like to make sure that I'm not incorporating too much unfermented flour into my dough. So the key here with working with your dough is to make sure it's fermented long enough, but not too long to where it's getting soupy. And you want to make sure that your hands are damp. So I'll press that dough out into a kind of rectangular shape, and then I will stretch it up, and you can stretch it as far as you can get it, and this is called laminating it, but I do a pretty gentle stretch here, nothing too crazy, because this bread will puff up since it has so much hydration. So I'll just stretch it in 4 different directions, and then I will fold it over almost like a jelly roll or a pumpkin loaf, and then fold it over once more just until you have a nice ball shape with the ends tucked under. Then I will push that dough with my right hand forward and pull it back with my left, and this helps to form a nice tight ball. Now, if you're not getting a nice tight ball, do this a few times, 3 to 4 times, and let it rest on the counter. You can put the dough tub over it to cover it and let it rest for 20 minutes, and that's going to help you get a nice tight ball the next time you shape it. So let that do what's called a bench rest, and then we'll come back to it. In the meantime, I'm taking a stick of salted butter, and I'm going to grease my loaf pan here just so that the bread comes out really easily. The soft sourdough sandwich bread has been rising for 6 or so hours, give or take a few minutes, since I'm doing these in tandem. Now I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my hands and wet them a little bit with filtered water, and then I will pull that dough out onto my countertop, and you can see how it's a different consistency. Nothing stuck in the dough tub, and it's a little bit glossier of a dough because of that butter and the milk in it. But I'll do the same thing. I'll press it into a rectangle with my fingers. I'll stretch it a little bit in every direction, just as far as as you can without tearing the dough. I like to make sure that it stays nice and together so that we get a smooth top. So I'll stretch it at the top, at the bottom, and side to side, folding it over on itself until it kind of looks like a rectangle. And roll the whole thing up, and then I will tuck those ends under. For this one, we want to make sure that it's a nice rectangle shape so we can put it into our rectangle loaf pan. But again, you can push it on the countertop, just making sure that top is nice and smooth and tight. Now I'll put that straight into that grease loaf pan, and I like to press it down with my fingers so it gets all the way to the edges so that it really forms to the shape of the pan and you get a beautiful loaf at the end. So just get a little rough with it, push it down with your fingers, don't be afraid to touch the dough, it's gonna be just fine. Some days if I'm in a rush and I need to eat this for dinner and cook it quickly, I will put it into my little Breville Smart Air Fryer Pro oven, and I will put it on proofing mode, and that just speeds things up a little bit more. And another option is you could put it in your regular big oven and turn the oven light on. That just makes a really conducive environment to get this bread to rise more quickly. But today I'm just doing it on the countertop so you can see exactly how it turns out. And I like to grease or butter a little bit of plastic wrap and put that right on top just so it doesn't stick but keeps that top of the bread nice and moist. Now that that one is ready to go and rising, I took my dough that's been doing its 20-minute bench rest just to get a nice tight ball. I reshaped it just by pushing and pulling with my hands, and then I'll use my little dough scraper here and I'll pick it up and flop it over into that floured banneton basket. And then I like to do what's called kind of like pinching the seams together or sewing the dough, and I just kind of overlap those seams so it doesn't split all the way open on the bottom and you get a nice bottom crust. Then I'll just turn my dough tub over on top of that and let it continue rising for up to 2 hours or until it's nice and puffy. Now, a long time before I bake my bread, usually about 40 minutes or so, I will turn my oven on to 450 and get that preheating. That way I can bake off the crusty boule in a really nice hot oven, and I leave my Dutch oven in the oven while that's happening so it's nice and preheated when I go to bake it. Now at this point, my loaf is a little bit under where I like it to be. I like it to be really risen and puffy, so that's perfect. I'm going to leave my sourdough loaf to rise a little bit longer and go ahead and put my boule into the oven. So I like to loosen the edges to make sure it hasn't stuck. Then I'll flip it over onto unbleached parchment paper. And that is my favorite way to bake off sourdough. You can do it without or with a silicone liner, anything, but I love buying these unbleached parchment paper in bulk. Makes it so easy. And then I'll just slice the top with a knife. You can use something to score it, like a lame, but I just like using my bread knife. I'll give it a little slit in the top, and you can put any sort of detail you want to, but as long as it has one big slit, you're usually good to go. And I'll pop that in, put the lid on, and into the oven to bake. And then after it's baked for a while, I'll leave the exact time below. I will remove the lid and let that crust finish browning. Once the bread has completely cooked through and is nice and golden on top, I'll use a wooden spatula or something like that to pull it out and put it onto a cooling rack. I'll slip that parchment paper from underneath it so that all the steam can kind of escape from the bottom. And you want to leave it for a minimum of an hour, but really overnight is probably ideal. You want to leave all that steam in there so you don't end up with a gummy bread and it has time to fully cool properly. Now I've lowered my oven temp, and I'm gonna bake off my soft sourdough sandwich bread. So my oven was already on, I just cooled it off. You can even crack open the door to let some of that hot air out so it's at the right temperature. And then I will cover it with foil a little bit of the way through if it starts to get too brown. It did get too brown today. I wasn't watching it carefully enough, but don't worry, it was still delicious. And then I'll pull the dough out of the oven once it's done, and I will immediately brush it with a little bit of room temperature butter all over the top, and that's going to give you that nice soft crust. I leave it in the pan to cool for about 5 minutes, then I will turn it out onto my board and put it on that same cooling rack with my other loaf of bread and let it cool fully before I slice into it. With my oven mitts on, I'll shake my loaf a little bit. You can also run a butter knife around the edges just to make sure it comes out well. But as you can see, buttering that stainless loaf pan works so well. So I just pop that out onto the counter. I'll put it on the cooling rack and let that cool completely. But I wanted to show you these breads here and now, so I'm gonna break the rules and slice into them. They're so good when you do that. We do it all the time and just put a little bit of butter on it, and there's nothing better than homemade hot sourdough bread. So as you can see, the inside of this kamut bread is nice and fluffy and airy. It's a little bit of a different texture than just normal all-purpose flour. It's a little more dense. I think with regular all-purpose flour, I get a little bit more of an airy, chewy crumb, but this one is so soft and tender, and this sandwich bread still turned out nice and fluffy. And I think it's interesting because this flour is similar to an einkorn flour as far as nutrients go, but I find it to be so much fluffier than einkorn. So if you've been baking with einkorn, maybe due to like gluten sensitivities or things like that, maybe try the kamut flour because I find that it gives a much better consistency to the dough. But you can also just use plain regular all-purpose flour with this recipe and you'll get incredible. Now to store my loaves, there's a million different ways you can store it, but I love using these unbleached little bakery style bags. It's the same bags that the people at my local farmers market sell their sourdough breads in, and they're just perfect for that. They're also amazing for gifting, and since it's that time of year, it would be an incredible holiday gift. I hope this video benefited you in some way. If you're new, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I make a new video pretty much every single week. I'll link up my sourdough playlist so you can check out my other sourdough videos like making your own sourdough starter and my step-by-step guide to making 4 different sourdough breads and sourdough rolls. So I'll have those linked in the playlist down below so you can check that out. Let me know if you guys want to see more sourdough recipes like this, kind of tutorial style, so I can share exactly how I do it, especially using the digital scale because I know not everybody uses one, but it's so easy once you figure it out. So let me know what you guys want to see next, and thanks again for joining me in the kitchen.